Greetings and welcome to today's Q&A. Here I'm taking questions from our previous Q&A video as well as an assortment of questions that were left on the channel over the last month's time. These are all things that I think we can all benefit from when brought up in an open forum. However, before we begin, I would like to quickly take care of a little bit of housekeeping, starting with the Patreon. And to begin, I'd like to say a big heartfelt thank you to everyone who is supporting me and this channel over there. It does make a big difference, and you make this channel really what it is. With that said, there are the two new summer paintings up on there. I really enjoyed them. They put me in a good place, in a good mood, and I think you'll really like them as well. In fact, they actually got me so happy about painting that I started the next months a little bit early, so keep an eye out for those as well. If you're unaware of what Patreon is essentially a monthly subscription service where you pledge a certain amount and then you receive rewards for doing so. An example, if you pledge $4 right now, you receive these 5-hour-long lessons immediately and a new hour-long lesson every month following that. In these lessons, I show you my color palettes, how we're mixing paint, when I'm grabbing water, how much water I'm grabbing, and we really get to explore things in a much more deeper sense on these. We get to do a lot more layering, we get to build a lot more depth, and I think it really helps us build our understanding of how to create these landscapes. If you subscribe over there at the $8 level right now, you'll receive these 10-hour-long painting lessons immediately and 2 new hour-long painting lessons every month following that. So again, these are things that don't go away. You can always go back to them, you can rewatch them, you can rework on them, you can even amalgamate them if you're feeling extra creative. But it's a lot of fun, so go check that out. Link is in the description. With all of that being said, let's jump in to today's Q&A. What's the best light to paint in? This is a fantastic question. It's something that we all need to be cognizant of when we go into our painting because it can dictate so much in our painting. Let me begin by kind of painting a situation here. You're painting in your studio, it's at night, it's dark, so you turn on a lamp. That lamp is orange. You turn that on and then everything in the room becomes brighter, but it also gets a glaze of a warmer tone of an orange. So when you go to work with your palette, you're no longer working with a perceived white. What you're seeing is a warm white. If you're using a green, what you're seeing is a warm green. So what you're going to end up doing is working with colors that you don't think you're working with because everything's going to look a lot warmer. So when you take your painting out into the daylight the next day, you're going to look at it and you're going to realize that all of those colors you thought were very warm were actually a lot cooler. And they were just warmer in that room because of that glaze. The same goes for cool blue lighting. If you paint with that on a dark night, then your palette, it's going to look a lot colder. So you'll be using reds and oranges and you'll think they'll be very cool reds and oranges. But when you see them in natural lighting the next day, you'll learn that they were actually very warm and that the lighting was just cooling them. So you won't actually get a proper perspective of the pigments that you're using if you paint with a very warm or cold light. The goal is to paint with very natural light, things that are close to akin of the sun. I actually do all of my 10-minute lessons and all of my hour-long lessons in sunlight, but not direct sunlight, because direct sunlight will cast heavy reflections. You want reflected sunlight. So you want to paint in a room and ensure that the canvas isn't directly facing the light. Now, this can be difficult when you want to paint at night because obviously there isn't any sun. What you can do in that scenario is simply to buy lights that are closest to a pure neutral white. Nothing warm and nothing cool. Should you achieve all of this, you should have a natural viewing of your pigment, and it shouldn't be distorted to the cooler or warmer tones. You'll be able to work with something that's actually correct and perceived properly, something that you won't go back to later and think, I thought I used a lot warmer colors, or I thought I used a lot cooler colors. You will get exactly what you want. It generally puts me off sometimes how the texture of a slightly rougher canvas tends to give paintings a sort of pixelated effect. What sort of canvas would give the best effect in terms of smoothness, or are they all pretty much the same? This is a great question, as we all do have a lot of preference regarding the texture of our canvas. I personally prefer something with a lot of tooth and a lot of texture. However, for those of you who do not, there is a very easy answer, and that is additional layers of gesso on your canvas or canvas board. This will smooth everything out very nicely, and you can apply it to most every canvas. Generally, cheaper canvases have a lot more tooth in them, a lot more texture, as the companies won't prime them to as great of an extent. Generally, a much more costly canvas will come heavily primed, and it'll be very smooth and very much void of that texture. However, what you should be aware about is the more texture, generally the more the paint can kind of sink in and stay on top, so you don't have to use as much paint. However, with something that's very smooth, when you apply it, you'll generally get a much more transparent acrylic as it just glides across rather than sits on top of. So you'll have to do more layering with that type of canvas and that type of texture. But if you are looking for something a little bit more smooth, A, buy gesso, or B, buy more expensive canvases. And this is generally a good rule for most brands. How much water do you advise to be used for acrylic? This is something that's going to change very much dependently upon the subject in which you are rendering. So, to begin, when I paint clouds, I generally want them to be very transparent. I want to see through a lot of them. I want them to look soft. As a result, I interject a lot of water into my mixture. This is going to make things a lot more transparent. It's going to thin the paint a lot, and it's going to render me the clouds that I want. However, if I'm going to render something more akin to a tree, something that's much more hard and opaque, I won't use much water at all, as I want it to be much more strong. I don't want to see through it. I want the pigment to be very thick. However, if we're painting a tree in the background and I want it to adopt the colors of the background, then I might use a lot of water because I want to see through that pigment. So it's one of those things where it's dependent upon literally every subject. It is going to change dramatically. Over on my Patreon, I do show you how much water I'm using in every scenario. So if you are very curious, that is an answer, but it is something that, in general, think about how transparent do I want this to be? If it's very transparent, use a lot of water. If it's not transparent at all, then don't use much water at all. You might need a little bit just to ensure that your lines are still sharp and that your application spreads decently, but avoid it as much as possible in those scenarios with more opaque subjects. What would be the possibility of doing a 10-minute painting and incorporating a tutorial of how to use tan colors and not have the piece look flat and lifeless, even if that's the color it should be? I hope you made sense of what I'm trying to ask. I think I did, and to answer your question, I do intend on doing a 10-minute painting tutorial of a desert scene, one that's going to incorporate sand dunes and pyramids. It should be done with a lot of tan tones and still incorporate a lot of depth and retain a very three-dimensional look. So hopefully that tutorial will be exactly what you are looking for. Do you have any tips for cleaning brushes after painting? I always find it so difficult to thoroughly clean my brushes. They often end up scruffy, with paint still on them, etc. Just ruined. Sometimes I end up throwing them out because I don't want to deal with it. This is something that I think a lot of people go through when they begin painting. I know I certainly did, and it's actually a very easy trick to avoid this issue. That trick being wetting your brush fairly frequently after you're done using it. A lot of us innately tend to paint something, we put our brush down, we grab another one, and we let that brush dry with paint on it for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. As that paint dries, it condenses, it hardens, and at a point, we can't wash it off because it's no longer viscous or a liquid, right? So what we need to ensure that we do is, if you use a brush, dip it in water, clean it off very quickly. It doesn't have to be a thorough cleaning, it just needs to ensure that the majority of the paint has come off of the brush. Generally, you can actually keep even poorly made, cheap brushes for an incredibly long time as long as you take care of them and ensure that you are frequently wetting them after they have paint on them. So just ensure that when you're going through your painting process, don't put off washing all of your brushes to the end. Do it as you're actually done with them. And again, it doesn't have to be a thorough wash, it just needs to be a dip in water and a little bit of a rinsing as well. At most, it will take 10 seconds and it will preserve the life of most all of your brushes. Have you thought about any new painting challenges? I had a suggestion on the channel the other week, and it was to paint with materials that I innately do not like. And I thought that was a very funny way of doing things. I think we could come up with something that's, in the very least, entertaining. So I like the idea of that challenge. But aside from that, not really. So if any of you at home have any kind of ideas for different fun painting challenges, leave them in the comment section down below, and I'd be happy to kind of give them some thought and maybe do a couple of them in the future. There's one animal I can think of that you might actually be able to pull off in 10 minutes. How about a jellyfish? This is a great idea. This is something I would really like to try. I did recently do 2 underwater paintings that are yet to be posted. I absolutely loved working with that. It's something that I was very much unfamiliar with prior to these last 2 lessons, and now that I've started, I found that I really loved it, and you can look forward to that sort of thing in the future, and now the inclusion of jellyfish as well. Hi Ryan, I love your paintings. I would love to try and make my own, but I have the hardest time coming up with ideas. Could you please share how you come up with ideas? The answer to that is yes. Now, there are 100 ways to come up with different ideas, but I'll share with you some of my favorites. The first being, when you want to create something very personal, pick a mood, pick an atmosphere, pick how you're feeling, however you are emoting at that time. Think about the colors that are associated with it and then the subjects that are also associated with it. Then build a composition around that color scheme and those specific subjects. You slowly begin to interject more things that kind of come to mind with that, and you just build up a composition to aid that main subject. So that is option number 1. Option number 2 is combining varying reference photos. As a lot of you know, I do like to use reference photos. I use a lot from graphicstock.com, but I also like to go out and I like to take my own photos. Just over the last couple of weeks, I went spelunking, I went on a couple of large hikes, I went out to a lake, went out to a lot of different nature destinations and things that I personally find inspiring. So the answer is A, you can do it from your imagination. B, you can do it from a combination of reference photos. C, you can go out and actually experience these things and take your own photos or even draw on the way. There are so many different ways of coming up with ideas, coming up with inspiration. And if you aren't feeling inspired, I vehemently feel that dedication is more important than inspiration generally when it comes to art. And what does that mean? It means that if we only ever painted when we were inspired by something, then we probably wouldn't ever become great painters because it wouldn't happen frequently enough. And when we did get inspired to finally go out and create something, we wouldn't have the technical skill to render it properly, and we'd probably be disappointed, which is why it's important that we are frequently painting despite inspiration or not. Generally, if I'm not feeling inspired, I'll follow a tutorial or I'll copy an old classical painting. I'll try to do something more akin to that just to get my technical skill up to where it needs to be so when I am inspired by something, I can go out and create. So there are a lot of different ways to create, to come up with ideas, but there's also a lot of value in following tutorials, in painting things that already exist, in just keeping up with your technical skills, as it will make you a much more efficient painter. It's also worth noting that if you want help building up compositions, if you look in my book at the section on rule of thirds and compositions, it really teaches you how to organize all of the pieces in your painting, where to put your horizon line, where to put your subjects, and how to lead the viewer's eye. So if that's something you're interested in creating your own work and creating your own painting, there are different steps and guidelines you can take to ensure that it's always kind of technically correct. And again, I do talk about that in my book, Acrylic Painting for Beginners, which is linked in the description of this video. With that being said, that is the end of today's Q&A. Thank you so much for listening here today. I hope that you feel like you've learned something. If you have any questions you would like the answer to for the next Q&A, leave them in the comment section down below. But if you are scrolling through the comments, you see a question asked and you know the answer to it, please interject, please help someone out, please help build this artistic community and ensure that everyone is learning and feeling confident about what they are doing. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with another 10-minute painting tutorial. Again, if you'd like hour-long lessons, they are offered over on my Patreon. There are now over 10 of them. That's not true, there are 10 of them. Next month, there will be over 10 of them, so go check that out. Thank you, and as always, stay creative.